A janitor? That's the best you could do after all these years, my ex-husband said loudly across the Christmas dinner table, and the worst part wasn't his words. It was hearing my own children laugh with him. Jack, the man they were mocking, simply smiled and reached for his coffee cup. At the time, they thought they were humiliating him. They had no idea they were humiliating themselves. I'm Evelyn Parker, and at 67 years old, I thought I had already experienced every kind of heartbreak life could offer. I had survived a difficult divorce. I had buried my parents. I had spent years learning how to rebuild a life that looked nothing like the one I had imagined in my 20s. But nothing prepared me for the loneliness of sitting at a Christmas table surrounded by people who shared my blood and realizing I was the only one in the room who still remembered what kindness looked like. The snow had been falling since early afternoon, covering the neighborhood in a blanket of white. Christmas lights glowed from every house on the street. Families were gathering. Children were opening presents. Holiday music drifted from living room windows as people celebrated together. It should have been a beautiful evening. For a moment, as Jack and I drove to my ex-husband's house, I allowed myself to believe it would be. The invitation had come from my daughter Ashley. "Mom," she had said over the phone, "it's Christmas. We're family. Let's just have one nice dinner together." I wanted to believe her. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe mothers never stop hoping. Richard's house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, decorated with enough lights to be visible from half a mile away. The same house we had once chosen together more than 30 years ago, back when we were young, back when I thought marriage meant forever. Jack parked the car and walked around to open my door. That was the kind of man he was. Thoughtful, steady, the kind of gentleman who noticed when someone needed help carrying groceries or shoveling a driveway after a snowstorm. The kind of man who remembered birthdays without reminders and always asked about people's lives because he genuinely cared about the answers. None of those qualities seemed to matter to my children. The only thing they saw was the word janitor. We stepped inside and were greeted by the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh pine. Ashley hugged me politely. Brandon nodded from across the room. Neither of them looked particularly happy to see me. Richard, however, looked delighted. Not because I had arrived, because he had found his audience. Dinner began normally enough. Small talk, holiday stories, weather complaints, football on the television in the next room. Then Ashley asked Jack how work was going. I saw the look that passed between her and Richard, a look that reminded me of high school students preparing a joke at someone else's expense. Jack answered honestly, "Busy. We're preparing the campus for the spring semester." Richard smirked. "Still pushing a mop around?" A few people chuckled. Jack smiled politely. Among other things. Richard leaned back in his chair. "I just have to say it, Evelyn. I never imagined you'd end up engaged to a janitor." More laughter followed. Brandon lowered his eyes, pretending not to participate, but he was smiling too. Ashley covered her mouth as if she were trying to hide her amusement. I felt my stomach tighten. Not because of Richard. He had spent years trying to make himself feel bigger by making other people feel smaller. What hurt was seeing my children join him, seeing them become versions of him. Jack remained calm. He stirred his coffee slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't seem embarrassed at all. That almost irritated Richard even more. "Come on," Richard said. "Don't tell me nobody finds this funny." Ashley laughed openly this time. Brandon joined her, and as their laughter filled the room, Jack finally looked up. He wasn't angry. He wasn't hurt. He simply looked at each of them with an expression I couldn't quite understand. Then he smiled. It was the calmest smile I had ever seen. The kind of smile a person wears when they already know something everyone else in the room has yet to discover. And somehow, sitting there beneath the glow of the Christmas lights, I suddenly had the feeling that this dinner was not going to end the way any of them expected. The laughter lingered for a few seconds longer before slowly fading into the background noise of clinking silverware and holiday music. I looked down at my plate and carefully cut a small piece of turkey, more interested in controlling my expression than eating. After a certain age, you learn that not every insult deserves an immediate response. Sometimes silence reveals more about people than any argument ever could. Across the table, Richard looked pleased with himself. He always had. During our marriage, he had been the kind of man who measured success by appearances. Bigger houses, newer cars, more expensive watches. He believed status was proof of character. For years, I had mistaken confidence for wisdom. The divorce had taught me otherwise. Ashley reached for her wine glass and smiled awkwardly. Dad is only joking, Mom. That sentence stung more than the laughter. It reminded me how often cruelty disguises itself as humor when people do not want to take responsibility for their words. Brandon nodded in agreement. Nobody means anything by it. Nobody means anything by it. Funny how people always say that when they are not the target. Jack simply continued eating. Calm. Unbothered. Steady. Watching him remain composed somehow made the rest of the room seem even more uncomfortable. Richard tried again. So tell me, Jack, what exactly is the long-term plan? You retire from mopping floors and buy Evelyn a castle. A few nervous chuckles followed. This time, even some of the relatives seemed uncertain whether they should laugh. Jack folded his napkin carefully before answering. I am quite happy with my life. His voice was relaxed. Friendly even. Richard smirked. That was not really an answer. It was the answer I wanted to give, Jack replied. For the first time all evening, Richard seemed caught off guard. He had expected embarrassment. Maybe anger. Instead, he found a man who did not seem interested in competing. I glanced around the room. The Christmas decorations sparkled from every corner. Garland wrapped around the staircase. Red bows hung from the windows. A massive tree stood beside the fireplace, covered in ornaments collected over decades. I recognized many of them. Some had once belonged to me, back when this house had still felt like home. Back when Christmas mornings meant sleepy children running downstairs in pajamas. Back when Ashley would sit beside me on the couch and Brandon would beg to open one more present before breakfast. Looking at them now felt strange. They were successful adults with careers and families of their own. Yet somehow they seemed smaller than the children I remembered. Success had given them confidence, but not necessarily wisdom. Mom always had a soft spot for projects, Ashley said lightly. Maybe that is why she likes him. The words were wrapped in a smile, but the meaning landed hard. I noticed Jack glance toward me, not because he needed defending, because he was checking whether I was all right. That simple gesture nearly broke my heart. Richard had spent years speaking over me. Jack listened. Richard liked being admired. Jack paid attention. The difference mattered more than any job title ever could. A few minutes later, the front doorbell rang. Ashley stood to answer it. Through the dining room, I heard voices in the foyer. Then another voice. Then several more. Something about the sudden change in tone caught my attention. Ashley sounded surprised. Very surprised. Moments later, she returned looking confused. Dad, she said quietly. There are some people here asking for Jack. The room fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Richard frowned. For Jack. Ashley nodded. They said it is important. For the first time that evening, I saw something shift behind Jack's eyes. Not worry. Not fear. Recognition. He set down his coffee cup and smiled that same calm smile again. The smile that seemed to know exactly where the evening was headed while the rest of us were still trying to catch up. Jack stood from the table with the same quiet confidence he had shown all evening. No rush. No anxiety. No need to explain himself. He simply adjusted the sleeve of his sweater and excused himself politely before walking toward the foyer. Every eye in the dining room followed him. The holiday music still played softly in the background, but nobody seemed to hear it anymore. Richard leaned back in his chair and scoffed. This should be interesting. Ashley glanced toward the hallway. Who would be looking for him on Christmas Eve? Brandon shrugged, though I could tell he was curious. I sat quietly, watching. Something about the way Jack carried himself made me feel unexpectedly calm. Most people become uncomfortable when they are embarrassed. Jack looked completely at ease. A minute later, voices drifted into the dining room. Respectful voices. Professional voices. Then footsteps approached. 3 people entered behind Jack. The first was a distinguished woman in her 60s wearing an elegant navy coat. The second was a tall man carrying a leather portfolio. The third was an older gentleman whose face seemed vaguely familiar. The room immediately grew still. Ashley looked confused. Brandon frowned. Richard straightened slightly in his chair. The woman smiled warmly when she saw Jack. There you are. We were afraid you might have already left. Jack shook her hand. I did not expect you to come all the way out here tonight. We insisted, she replied. This could not wait until after the holidays. The man with the portfolio nodded. The board was unanimous. Richard glanced around the table. I am sorry, he interrupted. Have we met? The woman turned politely. I do not believe so. She introduced herself and several relatives immediately recognized the name. She was the chairperson of one of the most respected educational foundations in the state. I noticed Ashley blink twice. Even Richard seemed surprised. The older gentleman stepped forward next. Jack, everyone at the academy sends their regards. Jack smiled. Thank you. The students are already talking about the announcement. At that moment, I saw confusion spreading around the room. Richard looked from one guest to another, clearly trying to understand why these people knew a school janitor so well. The answer never seemed to occur to him. The chairwoman opened a small envelope and handed it to Jack. We wanted you to have this personally. Jack accepted it, but did not open it. That was not necessary. Actually, she said, smiling, it was. She turned toward the rest of us. I hope you all realize how fortunate you are to know this man. Nobody responded. The silence was almost uncomfortable. Finally, Brandon spoke. What exactly is going on? The woman seemed surprised by the question. You mean you do not know? Richard forced a laugh. Apparently not. The three visitors exchanged brief looks. Then the older gentleman smiled. Well, that explains a lot. Jack lowered his eyes for a moment, as if hoping to avoid attention. The gesture alone told me everything I needed to know about his character. Whatever was happening, he had never intended to impress anyone with it. The chairwoman looked directly at him. Would you like to tell them, or should we? For the first time all evening, I saw something that looked almost like reluctance cross Jack's face. He glanced toward me, then toward the room filled with people who had spent the last hour judging him. Finally, he smiled softly. I think perhaps it is time everyone heard the whole story. Nobody spoke. Even the children in the living room seemed quieter somehow, as though the entire house was holding its breath. Jack remained standing beside the dining table while the three visitors waited patiently. He looked exactly the same as he had an hour earlier. Same sweater, same calm expression, same gentle smile. Yet the atmosphere around him had completely changed. Richard folded his arms. Well, we are waiting. His voice carried less confidence now. Jack nodded. There is not much to tell. The chairwoman laughed softly. That is classic Jack. 40 years of accomplishments, and he still thinks there is not much to tell. Ashley exchanged a glance with Brandon. I could see uncertainty growing behind their eyes. For the first time that evening, they were questioning the story they had created about him. The older gentleman stepped forward. Perhaps I can help. He turned toward the room. 27 years ago, the academy was struggling. Enrollment was falling. The buildings needed repairs. Most people assumed it would close within a few years. He smiled toward Jack. Then this man stepped in. Richard frowned. Stepped in. How? The gentleman looked surprised by the question. By saving it. Silence followed. Complete silence. Brandon blinked. What do you mean, saving it? The man opened his hands. Jack founded the education trust that funded the academy's expansion. He helped create scholarship programs for thousands of students. He financed the renovation of 3 campuses. He has spent decades supporting educational projects throughout the state. Ashley stared at Jack. Wait, are you saying he owns the academy? Jack shook his head. No, the academy belongs to the community. That was not the question, the chairwoman replied warmly. The question is whether it would still exist without you. Jack smiled but did not answer. Somehow his silence was more powerful than any speech. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. If all of that is true, why work as a janitor? It was the same question everyone wanted answered. Jack finally sat back down beside me before speaking. Because I enjoy it. Richard laughed once, but nobody joined him this time. Jack continued. After I retired from managing my investments, I spent a year doing nothing. I hated it. I missed being around people. I missed useful work. So I accepted a part-time position at the academy. He shrugged. I like helping students. I like keeping the campus beautiful. I like being part of something that matters. The simplicity of the answer seemed to confuse everyone. Ashley stared at him. You chose that job? Of course. Even though you did not need the money? Especially because I did not need the money. The older gentleman smiled. That is what makes him different. Most people spend their lives trying to look important. Jack stopped caring about that years ago. I looked around the table. Earlier, the room had been filled with laughter at Jack's expense. Now nobody seemed interested in making jokes. The chairwoman glanced toward the envelope still resting in front of him. You should probably open it. Jack sighed playfully. You all enjoy creating drama. Only when necessary, she replied. He opened the envelope and scanned the letter inside. For the first time all evening, I saw a genuine surprise cross his face. You cannot be serious. We are very serious, the man with the portfolio said. The vote was unanimous. Ashley leaned forward. What is it? The chairwoman smiled. The board has decided to rename the new scholarship center in his honor. The room fell silent again. Richard looked as though someone had removed the floor beneath his feet. Brandon stared at the table. Ashley lowered her eyes. And sitting beside me, the man they had spent the evening mocking simply folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope as though it were the least important thing in the world. The visitors remained for another 20 minutes, speaking warmly with Jack and sharing stories that seemed to make him increasingly uncomfortable. Not because he disliked the attention, but because he genuinely did not seek it. The more they praised him, the more he tried to redirect the conversation toward the students, the teachers, and the communities that had benefited from the programs. Eventually, the three guests wished everyone a Merry Christmas and left. When the front door closed behind them, a strange silence settled over the house. It felt different from the silence earlier that evening. Before, it had been filled with judgment. Now it was filled with reflection. Nobody seemed quite sure what to say. Richard stared into his glass for several seconds before clearing his throat. Well, he said, forcing a smile. That was certainly unexpected. Nobody answered. Ashley adjusted her napkin. Brandon focused on the table. The confidence that had fueled their laughter had vanished. I noticed something then. Not one person had apologized. Embarrassment and accountability are not always the same thing. People often feel uncomfortable when they are exposed, but that does not automatically mean they are willing to admit they were wrong. Jack reached for his coffee again and took a sip. He seemed perfectly content to let the silence do its work. Finally, Ashley looked at him. Why did you never tell us any of this? Her voice sounded softer now. Jack considered the question. You never asked. Ashley blinked. Most people would have mentioned it. Why? Jack replied gently. It would not change who I am. Nobody had an answer for that. Brandon shifted in his chair. I guess we made some assumptions. Jack smiled. Everyone does. There was no anger in his voice. No bitterness. Somehow that made his words land even harder. Richard tried another approach. You have to admit it is unusual. What is unusual? Jack asked. A man with your resources working a job like that. Jack set down his cup. Richard, may I ask you a question? The room immediately became attentive again. Richard nodded cautiously. Sure. How do you measure a person's value? Richard looked surprised. I do not know what you mean. Yes, you do. Jack's tone remained calm. What makes someone worthy of respect? Nobody moved. Even the fireplace seemed quieter. Richard laughed awkwardly. Success, I suppose. And what is success? Jack asked. Richard hesitated. Building something. Accomplishing goals. Providing for your family. Jack nodded. Those are good things. Then he smiled. So why did my job title matter more to you than my character? The question landed like a stone in still water. Nobody rushed to answer. The ripples spread everywhere. Ashley lowered her eyes. Brandon rubbed the back of his neck. Richard opened his mouth and then closed it again. For years I had watched people argue with each other. I had watched them defend themselves, justify themselves, and explain themselves. Yet one simple question seemed more powerful than any argument. Jack was not trying to win. He was simply holding up a mirror. And mirrors can be uncomfortable. A few minutes later, Ashley quietly excused herself and walked into the kitchen. Brandon followed soon after. Through the doorway, I could hear faint conversation. Low voices. Serious voices. The kind people use when they suddenly realize they may have crossed a line. Richard remained at the table, unusually quiet. He looked older than he had earlier in the evening. Not physically older, just smaller somehow. Less certain. I glanced at Jack. Are you all right? I asked softly. He looked at me and smiled. I am fine. They were not very kind. No, he said. But kindness is not tested when people treat you well. It is tested when they do not. I thought about those words for a long moment. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the windows. Inside, the Christmas lights reflected softly against the ornaments on the tree. For the first time all evening, the house felt peaceful. Not because everyone was happy, because the truth was finally sitting at the table with us. After dinner, people slowly drifted into the living room. Some gathered near the fireplace. Others stood beside the Christmas tree holding cups of coffee and dessert plates. The atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier, conversations had been loud and effortless. Now every word seemed measured. Every glance carried new meaning. I sat beside Jack on the sofa and watched my family navigate the uncomfortable reality of having misjudged someone so completely. Ashley eventually returned from the kitchen carrying a tray of cookies. She set it on the coffee table and lingered nearby. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then she looked directly at Jack. "I owe you an apology." The room immediately quieted. Jack looked up from his coffee. "For what?" Ashley took a deep breath. "For judging you." Her voice sounded sincere. "I made assumptions before I ever got to know you." Jack smiled gently. "You are not the first person to do that. That does not make it right." Ashley lowered her eyes. "I am sorry." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Jack nodded. "Thank you." There was no lecture. No attempt to make her feel worse. Just two simple words. Somehow that made the apology feel more meaningful. Brandon stepped forward next. "I should probably say the same thing." He laughed awkwardly. "Actually, I definitely should." The room relaxed slightly. Brandon shook his head. "I spent years telling myself I was open-minded. Tonight proved otherwise." Jack chuckled softly. "Life gives all of us opportunities to learn." Richard remained across the room, near the fireplace. He had not apologized. He had barely spoken at all. I knew that look. Pride had always been his favorite shield. The problem with pride is that it becomes heavier every year. Eventually, it weighs more than the truth itself. One of the grandchildren wandered over and climbed onto the sofa beside Jack. "Is it true you help students go to college?" the little boy asked. Jack smiled. "Sometimes." "That is cool." "I think so too." The child considered this for a moment. "Do you really clean classrooms?" "Absolutely." "Why?" Jack grinned. "Because classrooms deserve to be clean." The boy nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Then he ran off toward the Christmas tree. I watched him go and felt a strange warmth in my chest. Children often understand things that adults complicate. They care far less about titles and far more about character. An hour later, presents began appearing beneath the tree. Family members exchanged gifts. Wrapping paper collected on the floor. Laughter slowly returned to the house. This time it sounded different. Softer. More genuine. Yet I noticed something important. Several relatives had started asking Jack questions. Real questions. Not about money. Not about status. Questions about his life. His experiences. His values. The very things they should have asked from the beginning. As the evening continued, I found myself reflecting on the years after my divorce. There had been long stretches of loneliness. Holidays spent wondering whether life had already given me all the happiness I was ever going to receive. Then Jack had appeared unexpectedly. Not with grand promises. Not with dramatic gestures. Just kindness. Consistency. Respect. The things that matter most often arrive quietly. Near midnight, I stepped onto the back porch for a moment of fresh air. Snow covered the yard in a layer of silver beneath the moonlight. A minute later, the door opened behind me. Richard stepped outside. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he looked out across the snow-covered lawn and sighed. I was wrong about him. It was not a full apology. Not yet. But it was the closest thing I had heard from him all evening. I simply nodded. Sometimes growth begins with a single honest sentence. And for the first time in many years, I had the feeling that Christmas was not only changing my future, it was forcing everyone else to confront their own reflections as well. When Richard and I returned inside, most of the family had gathered near the tree again. The grandchildren were comparing gifts while the adults lingered with coffee and dessert. The tension from earlier had eased, but it had not disappeared completely. Some truths do not leave a room once they arrive. They simply settle into the corners and wait. I noticed Ashley watching Jack from across the living room. Not with suspicion anymore. With curiosity. It was the same expression Brandon wore as he listened to one of Jack's stories about a student who had earned a scholarship and become the first college graduate in her family. Earlier that evening, they had seen a job title. Now they were beginning to see a person. The difference mattered. Around 10 o'clock, Ashley sat beside me on the sofa. For a few moments, she remained silent. Then she took a deep breath. "Mom, can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Of course." She glanced toward Jack before lowering her voice. "How long have you known?" "Known what?" "Who he really was." I smiled softly. "Since our third date." Ashley looked surprised. "And you never told us?" "No, why not?" I considered the question carefully. Because it was not my story to tell. Ashley stared at her hands. "I think I would have treated him differently if I knew. That is exactly why he never talks about it." The words seemed to hit her harder than I expected. She sat quietly for several seconds. That sounds awful when you say it out loud. Sometimes the truth does. Across the room, Brandon was having a similar conversation with Jack. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough to understand what was happening. Brandon was asking questions about business, investments, and the academy. The same son who had laughed at him hours earlier was now listening carefully to every answer. Jack treated him exactly the same way he had before. No resentment. No scorekeeping. No need to remind anyone what had happened. I admired that about him. Most people want revenge when they are disrespected. Jack preferred understanding. Later, while everyone was distracted by a board game with the grandchildren, Ashley approached Jack directly. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask. Were you offended tonight?" Jack smiled thoughtfully. "A little." Ashley winced. "I am sorry." "Thank you." She hesitated. "Then why did you stay so calm?" Jack looked toward the Christmas tree, its lights reflecting softly in the window behind it. "Because people reveal themselves when they think someone has less power than they do." Ashley frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "Character is easy when everyone is impressed by you. The real test comes when you believe there is nothing to gain." Ashley lowered her eyes. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Jack added gently, "The good news is that people can grow." I saw tears gathering in Ashley's eyes. Not dramatic tears, just the quiet kind that appear when someone finally sees themselves clearly. Meanwhile, Richard sat alone in a chair near the fireplace. He was watching everything. Watching the conversations. Watching the laughter. Watching the respect that seemed to surround Jack naturally without ever being demanded. For years, Richard had chased admiration. Yet somehow the man he mocked had earned it simply by being himself. Shortly before midnight, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed. The sound echoed softly through the house. I looked around the room and realized something unexpected. For the first time in years, my family was having honest conversations. Not perfect conversations. Not comfortable conversations. Honest ones. And sometimes honesty is the greatest gift a family can receive, even when it arrives wrapped in embarrassment. As midnight approached, the house grew quieter. Some relatives had already begun gathering coats and wrapping leftover desserts for the drive home. The children were sleepy. The fireplace crackled softly. Outside, fresh snow continued falling beneath the glow of the streetlights. It should have felt like the end of an ordinary Christmas gathering. Instead, it felt like the end of something much larger. Richard finally stood from his chair and walked across the room. Several conversations immediately stopped. Everyone noticed. For a moment, he simply stood there looking at Jack. The same man he had mocked hours earlier. The same man he had dismissed without a second thought. Pride and humility seemed to be fighting a private battle behind his eyes. Then Richard did something I had not seen him do in years. He spoke honestly. "I owe you an apology." The room became completely silent. Jack looked up calmly. Richard nodded once. "What I said earlier was disrespectful." He glanced briefly toward me before continuing. "And unfair." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Richard took a slow breath. "The truth is, I made assumptions because it was easier than getting to know you." He shook his head slightly. "That says more about me than it does about you." Jack studied him for a moment. Then he stood and extended his hand. "Thank you." Richard accepted it. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed to release something that had been hanging over the entire evening. Ashley smiled faintly. Brandon looked relieved. Even some of the relatives appeared to relax. Yet the most surprising part came next. Richard laughed softly at himself. "You know what is embarrassing?" he asked. "I spent years thinking success was something people could see." Jack smiled. "Many people do." Richard nodded. "Turns out I was measuring the wrong things." For the first time that evening, the laughter that followed was genuine. Not cruel. Not directed at anyone. Just human. A little while later, Ashley approached me while everyone else was distracted by family photographs near the tree. "Mom," she said quietly, "can I tell you something?" I nodded. She looked down for a moment. "When you started dating Jack, I was angry." "I know. I thought you were replacing Dad." I listened without interrupting. "Then when I found out he worked at the academy, I convinced myself he was not right for you." Her eyes filled with regret. "The truth is, I never gave him a chance." I reached for her hand. "People make mistakes." "I know." She squeezed my fingers gently. "I just wish I had realized it sooner." Nearby, Brandon was helping the grandchildren stack empty gift boxes. Watching him laugh with the children reminded me of the little boy he used to be. For years I had blamed myself for every distance that had grown inside this family. Every missed call, every awkward holiday, every misunderstanding. But sitting there beside the Christmas tree, I finally understood something important. Parents cannot control who their children become. All they can do is continue showing up with love and hope that wisdom eventually finds its way home. As the evening drew to a close, people began saying their goodbyes. Hugs lasted a little longer than usual. Conversations felt more sincere. Before leaving, Ashley hugged Jack. Brandon did the same. Neither gesture erased the earlier hurt, but healing rarely arrives all at once. It arrives one honest moment at a time. Finally, after the last car disappeared down the snowy street, the house became quiet. Jack and I stood near the front door gathering our things. The Christmas lights still glowed softly around the room. Wrapping paper had been cleaned away. Coffee cups sat empty. The evening was over. Yet somehow it felt like a beginning rather than an ending. As we stepped outside into the cold winter air, I glanced back through the window one last time. Earlier that day, I had walked into that house feeling judged. I left feeling something entirely different. Not vindicated. Not triumphant. Simply free. Free from the need to prove anything. Free from the opinions that had once carried so much weight. And as Jack gently took my hand while snowflakes drifted through the night sky, I realized the greatest gift I received that Christmas was not respect from my family. It was finally understanding my own worth. The weeks that followed brought something I had not expected. Not dramatic change. Not perfect reconciliation. Just small moments that slowly added up to something meaningful. In January, Ashley called me on a Tuesday afternoon for no particular reason. She did not need advice. She did not need a favor. She simply wanted to talk. We ended up speaking for nearly an hour. A week later, Brandon stopped by my house with coffee and pastries from a bakery he knew I loved. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about work, family, and life. Ordinary conversations. The kind I had missed more than I realized. Meanwhile, Jack continued living exactly as he always had. He still worked at the academy. He still arrived early. He still greeted students by name. If anything, the attention from Christmas seemed to make him even more determined to avoid the spotlight. One afternoon, I asked him whether the scholarship center announcement had changed anything for him. He laughed softly and shook his head. Tomorrow morning, I still have classrooms to unlock. That was Jack. No matter how much respect people offered him, he never seemed interested in collecting it. He simply focused on being useful. By spring, our wedding plans were underway. Nothing extravagant. A small ceremony. Close friends. Family. A beautiful garden near the academy where flowers bloomed across several acres every April. One evening, while reviewing invitations at my dining room table, I noticed a familiar name written carefully across an envelope. Richard. I stared at it for several seconds before looking up at Jack. Are you sure about this? I asked. Jack smiled. Families are complicated. That is one way to describe them. He laughed. People grow, Evelyn. I thought about Christmas night. About pride. About assumptions. About all the ways people can lose their way without realizing it. Maybe he was right. The wedding day arrived beneath clear blue skies and mild spring temperatures. Friends gathered. Family gathered. Laughter filled the garden. When Ashley walked over to adjust a flower arrangement and Brandon helped greet arriving guests, I felt something heal inside me. Not because the past had disappeared. It had not. But because everyone present had chosen to move forward. During the reception, Richard approached our table. He looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for him. Then he handed Jack a small box. This is for you. Jack opened it and found an antique fountain pen inside. Beautiful, elegant, carefully preserved. Richard cleared his throat. My grandfather gave it to me years ago. Jack looked surprised. I cannot accept this. Yes, you can. Richard smiled faintly. A man should know when someone has taught him an important lesson. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jack shook his hand. Watching them, I realized something that had taken me decades to understand. Respect earned through fear never lasts. Respect earned through appearances fades quickly. But respect earned through character has a way of changing people. As the evening sun settled across the garden, I looked around at the people I loved. They were imperfect. So was I? Yet somehow we had all arrived at the same place. A place built on honesty rather than assumptions. A place where titles mattered less than actions. A place where kindness carried more weight than status. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the music had ended. Jack and I walked slowly through the garden beneath the glow of string lights. He reached for my hand and smiled. The same calm smile that had confused everyone months earlier. The smile that never needed to prove anything. I smiled back, because I finally understood what made it so powerful. It was the smile of a man who knew his worth without needing anyone else's approval. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. The people who truly know who they are never waste time convincing others. They simply live with dignity, let their actions speak, and trust that the truth will eventually arrive. It always does.